If I were in a court of law, Professor Hillier, with you, I would look at the tribunal and say, my learned friend is under complete misconception and illusion as to what is colonialism of the 21st century in the British Virgin Islands. I would have said that. And I'll explain to you why, and then ask you some questions and leave it to the floor. First of all, as you're aware, countries in international law are either sovereign or colonial. We might call them dependent territories and all that kind of thing, but they're either sovereign, represented in the United Nations, or colonial. For example, Puerto Rico is colonial. St. Thomas is colonial. The BVI is colonial. The French has territories, Martinique is colonial, and Guadeloupe, and so on. The Dutch have, they're colonial. The Spaniards have. When you talk of the Treaty of Westphalia, 1648, you must understand that in 1557, long before that, Spain had Cuba as a colony in the Caribbean. And what happened there? Big fight, economic fight. Long before the Europeans came to America. Economic. Whenever a country which is thought to be colonial stands up economically, the argument changes. And that's what happened to America in 1704. Let me show you what happened. And this is what is happening to the BVI right now. Edmund Burke was the greatest orator of his day in the British Parliament. And in 1704, he had to speak on two matters. On one, taxation against the Americans who were forming their own country, having left Europe and Britain. I invite you to keep and to look at a book published by Burke, Speeches on America. It was published by the University Tutorial Press in, anyhow, just after the Second World War. And I'm going to invite you to look at just pages 67 and 68. Listen to this very carefully. This is the colony of America. This is what Burke told the British Parliament, 1704. Before the Revolution, he said this. Sorry, 1774. He said this. The export trade to the colonies consists of three great branches. The African, which, terminating almost wholly in the colonies, must be put to the account of their commerce. The West Indian and the North American, all these are so interwoven that the attempt to separate them would tear to pieces the contexture of the whole, and if not entirely destroy, will very much depreciate the value of all the parts. I therefore consider these three denominations to be what in effect they are, one trade. The trade to the colonies, taken on the export side at the beginning of this century, that is in the year 1704, stood thus. Exports to North America and the West Indies, 483,000 pounds. To Africa, 86,000 pounds. In the year 1772, 68 years later, which I take as a middle year between the highest and lowest of time, those lately laid on your table, the account is as follows. To North America and the West Indies, 4,791,734 pounds. To Africa, 866,398 pounds. To which, if you add the export trade from Scotland, which had in 1704 no existence, 304,000 pounds, a total of 6 million pounds. I'm going to finish now. From 500 and odd thousand, it has grown to 6 million. It has increased no less than 12-fold. That is the state of the colony trade, as compared with itself at those two periods within this century. And this is a matter for meditation. See how the export trade to the colonies alone in 1772 stood in the other point of view. That is, as compared to the whole trade of England in 1704. The whole export trade of England, including that to the colonies in 1704, was 6,509,000. Export to the colonies alone in 1772 is 6,024,000 pounds. Colonies. Colony trade. This country of the British Virgin Islands you're talking about, you say it's a question of morality and whether it's justified. On the 17th of March, 1999, the British government published a paper, white paper, Partnership for Progress and Prosperity, Britain and the Overseas Territories, in which the foreword by the Foreign Secretary, the late Right Honorable Robin Cook, stated this, not long. He said this: under Partnership for Progress, not colonialism, keeping down, occupying, and so on. He said this, quote, Britain welcomes the economic prosperity and development built up by many of the overseas territories. Some are among the world leaders in the financial industry. We want those overseas territories with financial industries to operate and regulate them in internationally accepted standards, which is what's happening in the BVI. This will enable Britain to meet its own international obligations. It will ensure that we put up a common front against fraudsters, tax evaders, money launderers, regulatory abuse, and the drugs trade. And by doing so, we will be securing the future strength of the financial industries of Britain and the overseas territories, and safeguarding the global financial system. And in appendix to that paper, it was stated as follows: the financial services sector in the BVI has been growing rapidly in the recent years and now generates half of total government revenue. The BVI specializes in international business companies and is believed to have a dominant share of around 45% of the global market for this product. Before I stop, let me read you from a paper of the Economist. I used it in a speech, a worldwide speech I gave in Jamaica on the 25th anniversary of the Commonwealth Association, the Commonwealth Law Association. You will find it in the Economist of the 2nd of March, 2007, at page 19, small article, and then a 14-page pull-out. And I'll just read you two short excerpts. This is what it says. It's the Economist, one of the leading papers in the world, owned by the British, read most by the Americans. It's on every senator's desk every weekend. This is what it says. It speaks of the offshore companies, OFCs. Business in OFCs is booming. And as a group, these jurisdictions no longer sit at the fringes of the global economy. Offshore holdings now run to 5 trillion to 7 trillion, 5 times as much as 2 decades ago, and make up perhaps 6 to 8% of worldwide wealth under management, according to Jeffrey Owens, head of fiscal affairs at the OFCD Cayman, a trio of islands in the Caribbean, the world's 5th largest banking center, rivaling New York, because the biggest is London, not New York. With $1.4 trillion in assets, the British Virgin Islands are home to almost, wrote 700,000 offshore companies. All this has been very good for the OFCS economies. Between 1982 and 2013, they grew at an annual average rate per person of 2.8%, over twice as fast as the world as a whole, which is 1.2%. According to a study of James Hines of the University of Michigan. Individual OFCs have done even better. Bermuda is the richest country in the world, with a GDP per person estimated at almost $70,000, compared with $43,500 for America. See Chart 1. Chart 1 on the other side puts the British Virgin Islands 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, put United States 10th, and puts the BVI 12th. We had over 40,000 too. And it ends this way. On average, the citizens of Cayman, Jersey, Guernsey, and the BVI are richer than those in most of Europe, Canada, and Japan. And the article ends this way. This special report will argue that although international initiatives aimed at reducing financial crime are welcome, the broad concern over OFCS is overblown. Well-run jurisdictions of all sorts, whether nominally on or offshore, are good for the global financial system. Having heard that, I therefore would like you to review your views that when we have the right to say we want independence, we don't say it. What does that tell you? It's a matter of choice. The United Nations says you have the right, but it does not say you must take it. We can choose our time to take it. It is not, if I have the choice to be independent, and I choose to remain in partnership, not the colony of Britain, in partnership with them. Because our judges, they get our judges to join them to sit in their final court. I don't know if you're aware of that. West Indian judges sit on the Privy Council. I don't think it's an illegitimate occupation. I don't think it's a question of immorality. I don't think it's a question of illegality. I think it's a question of partnership. And I don't believe that we in the BVI have anything to be inhibited about if we say we want to remain in that status for some time and we choose our time. That is my view.
Well, I don't disagree, and as I said, I wasn't here to say to the people of the British Virgin Islands that you should move immediately or as quickly as possible to independence. The issue of morality and legality, as I indicated in my presentation, is if the way the British Virgin Islands and the African continent, the rest of the Caribbean, came to be occupied under a law that has since been delegitimized. So what is the legal or moral basis for continuing that so-called partnership? I'm not opposed to a partnership of equals or a partnership where one has the same right as the other partner. That's treaties. When you sign treaties, you sign as equals. Okay? The problem I have is that what happens if the British government says tomorrow, I want everyone in Tortola to evacuate? What right do you have? None.
Of course we will say we're not going to evacuate. This is our home. Come and bring your guns, try to get us out.
So,
are you hearing me? Oh, okay. Yes, I want to make a little comment. I noticed, Professor, that you didn't mention Resolution 1541, which I think states that there are three options: independence, free association, and integration. Now I know since that time, many persons have argued that there should be a fourth option. And I see Honorable Kedrick Pickering in the back here. And I remember before he was a legislator, he was emphatic that there should be a fourth option. But the international community has ruled that there can be no fourth option, because any fourth option is akin to and tantamount to colonialism. And therefore, there has to be some other option. It's either once we have a referendum, we decide on independence, and it doesn't have to be immediate. We decide on integration, or we decide on free association. What do you say to those?
well, again, as I indicated in my presentation, I am an internationalist. I don't believe in borders, and I don't think the concept of sovereignty, this whole concept of sovereign statehood, which came out of Europe to solve a peculiar European problem that is now global, is the solution to many of our common problems. Sovereignty is not going to solve the problems of refugees, displaced persons, the global environment, the spread of diseases. There are many problems that we as a global community must deal with as a community and not as sovereign states. So if we're looking for solutions to global problems that is permeating the world today, you're not going to find it in creating more sovereign states. Because even the sovereign states that are emerging, whether it's Kosovo, South Sudan, cannot sustain themselves without being tagged to the International Monetary Fund or other financial institutions. What I'm saying, the world has to move towards something more than this European concept of sovereign statehood that Europe itself has realized is not a viable solution to many of their common problems. So we need to begin to have a discussion on where do we go as a global community in integrating those who've been left behind, and still that legacy of what led to the British or French or US or whoever. Because, I mean, when you think about it, it's an insult to the people of the US Virgin Islands when the United States government purchased the US Virgin Islands from Denmark for $25 million. What did the United States purchase? Is it the land? Is it the rights to the territory? Is it the people? None of the above. So much of this issue, and I mean, I respect what Dr. Archibald has said. No, that option of when do you decide to give up, you know, your partnership with the UK but if you look at the model, the Dutch model or the French model, it's completely different from the UK model. Because the French Antilles are represented in the French National Assembly. The Dutch Antilles have a similar status with The Hague. The British territories are treated as outsiders. And as I indicated, the orders, that whole mentality that led to colonialism, of seeing people of non-European descent as the orders, is still what governs the relationship between Britain and its overseas territories. So, you know, we really have to think about it, because yes, we all have privileges as British subjects or US subjects coming from the US Virgin Islands, or French subjects or Dutch subjects. But morally, continuing to have some other group preside over someone else is something we have to think about as black people who've had a 500-year of struggle. We didn't get to where we are today because Britain loved us so much.
Professor Hillier, I say this. In your audience tonight, you have a minister of government who sometimes acts as the chief minister. He's the deputy chief minister. You have a former attorney general in this, who was also a deputy chief minister, and you have deputy premier, and you have in the audience too a young gentleman, I still call him young, who was the chairman of the Constitutional Commission, out of which we got our last constitution. That's Mr. Jerry Ferrara, QC. You have also Mrs. Dancia Penn, QC, and you have the Honorable Kedrick Pickering. There are others whom I don't want to mention right now. But question time from the floor. Could you come to the podium and direct your question, please? Anybody?
Good evening.
Good evening.
You can say who you are for him. Yes.
Troy Christopher.
And for the record, because I think it's being taped.
Hey, Troy Christopher, great discussion. One of the questions I have was whether you see any differences in the way the colonial powers have responded to this new environment and these new laws that have been that we're using, or rights that we are entitled to. There seems to be a difference between how the Dutch or the French may choose to have a partnership out of a colonial entity in reference to having some perception of a seat around the table, versus the history of the British and how they have viewed this partnership. I noticed that Dr. Archibald, I think, if I'm not mistaken, quoted from either the 10 or 12-year-old white paper. And we have noticed a distinct difference in the wording of that era to the new white paper that has been presented and the attempts that has been made to pull back some of the, we felt that we were on a path to this partnership. And I'm wondering whether there's any reference you can see in terms of the British, in terms of how they have been able to create partnerships from existing colonies, or have they all gone the way of some of the other Caribbean countries and some other countries where this hostile approach has been taken after the fact, and you fall in the hands of the IMF and some of these other different traps that has been laid? Thanks.
Thank you. Let me just say, Britain occupied the Caribbean, the Jamaica, Trinidad, Barbados, in Barbados the longest, 350 years. When Britain withdrew from the Caribbean, and let's not forget, the Caribbean was very instrumental in the Industrial Revolution in England. And we should take pride as Caribbean people and our African American brothers in the southern United States, who were the ones who gave free labor to provide the economic engine that now provides the high standard of living for people in Europe and the United States. We have never gotten an apology for slavery, for colonialism, for we have never been compensated for the contributions we made to the global economic powers. So all I'm saying today, Britain has never been kind to anyone of color, not even those born in England today. And when Barack Obama was elected president in 2008, Tony Blair was interviewed and was asked what he thinks of an African American becoming president of the United States. His response was, only in America. Yes, only in America, because you do not expect those of color born in England, even though they are second generation British born, continue to be called West Indians. What does that say about a country that wants to colonize people of color? When you can't even recognize those of color born in your country.
Well, you know, I would put it this way, Professor Hillier. The question of colonialism is not new. It is over 10,000 years old. The Egyptians were sovereign and had a civilization that lasted over 2,500 years. That is to say, longer than the time of great moments of Greece to now. 2,500, they were not white people. Rome had Britain as a colony, had Britannicus, had Gaul, France as a colony.
I'm not
colony.
disputing that.
So
it was perfectly legal to have those. It was perfectly legal to have slaves.
I'm
500 years ago. Today it's not.
No, I'm not talking about slavery.
Well, the same as colonialism.
No, I am not talking about slavery. I'm talking about colonialism. But I leave that for another debate, if they are the same or not. I am not talking about slavery. I'm talking about colonialism.
Well,
colonialism today, I think, and the measure I have tonight is to get it. BVI case. You're a mission to tell us about the BVI.
Well, as I said at the beginning, I did not want to single out the BVI.
You have to blame Dr. Smith for that.
Because we do have other colonies around the world, and we should not just single out, because the BVI is not in this situation all by itself. Go ahead.
I would like to say tonight that I'm very unhappy about what has taken place here tonight. We as BVI landers do not wish to live in the past. We have long gone past what you've been talking about tonight. I personally respect Britain for what she has done for all her colonies, including those in Asia, Africa, and the rest of the world. You must not forget that the sun never set over the British Empire. But Britain came to the point where all her colonies in Africa are now independent. And she has brought her country to a certain standard. Going back to this financial situation, our good leader, Mr. Cyril Romney, was the man who stood up and fought for that. And I'll tell you something, I'm a talk show host. And I usually make this statement on my show. I don't care whether you're red, black, blue, salmon, yellow, or green. We have to forget that if we're going to move forward. And the owner of the station, little daughter, asked him one night, Daddy, could you ask Mr. Maduro if he ever saw a salmon man yet? We have gone beyond that. As you have rightfully said and others acknowledge here tonight, we have a high capita per income in the British Virgin Islands compared to the rest of the Caribbean and to the world. The BVI have come a long way, and I would like to say this to BVI landers. As I think my good friend here said, is either partnership, integration back with Britain, or independence. And I would say to my people, even if we go independent, we must maintain a very good relationship with the United Kingdom because she has brought us a long way. I was Chief Immigration Officer 20 years. And every time I met with the United States Virgin Islands immigration officers, they said, oh my God, you people in the British Virgin Islands are so far ahead of us. Yes, the people in the United States Virgin Islands are way behind us because a lot of their situation is dealt with by the federal law. All we have in terms of Britain is a watchdog. We run ourselves. We do what we want here in the BVI. I know there are some of us here who talk about this protocol thing, but they don't understand it. There's protocol in everything we do in life, even in the United Nations. I'm not talking of politics, I'm talking scientific facts. And what I want to say to all of BVI landers, stop this nonsense about racism and stop this nonsense about slavery. We have gone beyond that. And let us learn to live like human beings. Thank you very much.
Good night, everyone.
Good night.
Good night, Professor Hillier. I thank you for your brave presentation tonight. I was sitting in the audience and reflecting on how I thought I was courageous. But when I listened to your presentation, I realized I was not courageous at all. So I definitely respect your presentation and for standing by the courage of your convictions. I've adopted the name Uhuru, which means freedom or independence in Swahili. So I completely buy into the moral premise of your argument. But I think you would have to live in the BVI for some time to realize somewhat of a paradox that exists here. The BVI people are very independent and love their autonomy, absolutely. But at the same time, I would say the majority of the people here would say no to independence. So for you to understand that paradox, it would require a very kind of complex kind of analysis of the society. Britain, even today, and some of the countries that have built their wealth on slavery and colonialism are not nice today. And you see them invading countries up till today and violating all kind of laws, moral laws, and legal, all types of legal laws. Even the same United Nations, violating United Nations resolutions left and right. But here in the BVI, I'm not quite sure if we've had that experience in recent times. Because even though you are right, the governor, on behalf of the Queen, does have that authority, it has not really been exercised here. And in fact, I would say here in the BVI, we've suffered from a certain type of neglect from Britain. I think many scholars would have confirmed that. There's been a certain type of neglect. Before there was a lot of welfare in the financial services industry, there was a lot of neglect. And even after the financial services industry, I would still say that there's a certain level of neglect and leaving the people to themselves to a certain extent. It's a different climate right now, I would say, with this new government that we have in the United Kingdom right now. They seem to be asserting themselves much more. And I think this can be a continuing conversation when we start to see the types of relationship we have with the UK going forward. People will have a much better perspective on it. But in terms of morality, I think the people here have a balance between morality and practicality. And it was made clear to me when I was listening to the governing party's radio program, and the topic came up of same-sex marriage, which from a moral perspective, most people in the BVI would be against. But it was expressed on the program by some of the legislators that, well, if the UK tells us that we have to change our laws, we have to do it. There's nothing we can do about that. It's something that we are prepared to accept, even though the majority of people from the democratic sense would probably not be for it. Now, that's morality. Now, practicality. I was listening to the House of Assembly today, and they were speaking about the financial services industry and protecting the financial services industry. This is where the practicality comes in. And the two parties can be at each other's throats, every House of Assembly. But when it comes to financial services, we sing Kumbaya, and we unite, and no one can break our bond. That's the most united you will ever see us, is when we're discussing the financial services industry, because as has been expressed tonight, it accounts for probably about 60% of the government revenue, and it's very important to our economy. And people, we have grown accustomed to a particular type of lifestyle, and we are very fearful of seeing that lifestyle leave. Now, something that I don't quite understand, and I hope somebody can clarify it for me, is the relationship between independence and the financial services industry. I know the financial services industry has existed, in independent countries. I know the United Kingdom, who created this offshore financial services industry, is very much concerned about it and wants it to be in a politically stable jurisdiction where they have influence. If the BVI were to choose independence, which majority don't want, what would become of the financial services industry? This is really my query.
Your question is a valid one, but I'm not so sure it is for tonight.
Okay.
And I don't know if that is a right. I don't know if I would be fair to Professor Hillier to ask him to deal with that for the record. I'm not sure. And if he's going to try to deal with it, I'll give him some time to think first. Let me interject a question before here. Before you come to the podium, I have to ask Professor Hillier a question which he is an expert in. Professor Hillier, when one thinks of independence, sovereignty, a country must have trained foreign service staff, ambassadors, etc. And I noticed in your resume and in the history of your life as an international lawyer you have been recruited to interview people to see how well they have done as ambassadors and as foreign service officers. Here in this country, we have not yet begun to train or select people for down-the-road service as foreign service officers, ambassadors, and so on. Could you tell us a word about that for a few minutes before you move on to another question?
Okay. If you don't, I can come back to that, but he made a very important point, which I think in this whole debate on colonialism, and it affects even the independent Caribbean countries as well. This whole issue of same-sex marriage or the right of same-sex partners or the rights of people with people who are homosexuals, protection against discrimination and what have you. Again, this directive coming down from the UK, coming down from the European Union, coming down from other countries that are very different from the Caribbean culture, from people's religious conservative views, who are not very supportive of those measures, but are forced to implement them simply because they fall under the jurisdiction of the UK or France or the United States or elsewhere. So that is one of the issues that, again, is very important when one is looking at relationship between the metropolitan power and the colony, because whereas the culture is different, the tradition is different, our views on certain issues are different, we have no choice but to implement measures handed down by the metropole or by institutions within, because otherwise these countries will be squeezed, they won't receive financial assistance from the US or from the European Union if they continue to resist implementing measures to protect people or to grant them the same rights as they would enjoy in the metropolitan countries. So it's a very good point, and I hope the people of the BVI and elsewhere are paying attention to that. With regards to the foreign service training, it is not difficult to train foreign service officers. There are several foreign service institutes. There's, I believe there's one in Trinidad, there's one in the US, there's one in Brussels, and you know, the United Nations also, it's technical, provide technical assistance to train newly independent countries to have a foreign service corps. So again, doing so, even doing it for some countries, as you indicated, is not a problem. Governments usually recruit experts in international law, in United Nations law, to come and train their diplomats on a 2-week, 3-week, 4-week basis, and to get them up to speed if the need arises where they have to assume that responsibility.
Before we go on to the next question, I was talking with Professor Hillier today about the great Jamaican QC Dudley Thompson, who defended Jomo Kenyatta on a charge of treason and got him not guilty, but he was convicted for a lesser offense. Today, his son is the 4th president of Kenya. And I think my learned friend, Professor Hillier, is dealing with a matter in the International Court of Justice relating to that son, Uhuru Kenyatta. So I don't know what his claim in the court will be, but I hope whatever he's doing, we will see the effect of his jurisprudential efforts. I thought I'd mention that, Professor Hillier.
Well, those of you who follow developments in Africa will recall about 5 years ago, they had an election in Kenya, and because the election results were disputed, you had intra and inter-tribal violence that led to the death of a few thousand innocent civilians. Kofi Annan from Ghana, the former Secretary General of the United Nations, was picked by the African Union to broker some agreement between the two political parties. And in investigating the violence, Kofi Annan came up with a secret list of some 19 names that he did not give to the AU, which gave him the mandate to broker the agreement. He handed it to the the prosecutor for the International Criminal Court. The International Criminal Court is a new tribunal intended to try people whose countries are unable or unwilling to try them for war crimes, crimes against humanity, or genocide. And the court has jurisdiction if the perpetrator is a citizen of a state party to the court, or the matter is referred to the court by a government or by the Security Council of the United Nations. Kofi Annan handed the list to the prosecutor. The prosecutor, in turn, exercised his discretion and initiated an investigation into the atrocities. He came up with 4 or 6, I believe it was 4, including the current president of Kenya, who is the son of the first president, Jomo Kenyatta.
That's prior to the elections.
But the indictment was handed down while Uhuru Kenyatta was the finance minister in Kenya. Immediately after the prosecutor initiated the investigation, we did not know whose names were on the list. My friend, who is a lawyer, defense attorney at the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda, contacted me and said, we need to write a brief to the International Criminal Court objecting to the jurisdiction of the court in the Kenyan situation, which we did. And the 3-judge panel voted 2-1, with the opposing judge citing our justification to deny the court jurisdiction in the Kenyan matter. The basis for the legal challenge was that Kenya and all African countries had fought bitterly to get to where they are today. And if there is an intra-tribal conflict in an African state, the matter should not be decided by judges at The Hague. It should be decided where the crime alleged to have occurred. And my take was the Kenyan government should have the courage to establish a tribunal and to prosecute those responsible for killing innocent civilians. I received a number of death threats. They did not know who I was. Basically, they assumed because of my name, I was a white person sitting in an ivory tower in America and having some influence over what took place in Kenya. I responded to all the emails to let them know I was of African background as well, and that I had a vested interest in what was going on in Kenya. I had visited Kenya, lectured in Kenya, and knew exactly what the political situation was. Soon after the indictment, I then received a lot of letters, emails, saying that my position and that of the 2 other attorneys, was the correct position. And had the government of Kenya listened, they would not have found themselves in the predicament they find themselves today. So the court went ahead and indicted the finance minister of Kenya and 3 other individuals. The people of Kenya, a few weeks ago, turned around and elected the indicted minister as their president. So his choice is to never leave Kenya, because if he leaves, he could be arrested, or to remain in Kenya and to be an ineffective president. Or you cooperate and surrender to the International Criminal Court. So you say to yourself, if the people who were victims elected someone that an international tribunal claimed to be the perpetrator of the most vicious post-election violence in Kenya, then what should the court do?
Well, Professor Hillier, this scenario of facts has never occurred before. And as you know, Mr. Ocampo, the prosecutor, is talking with a lot of jurists around the world as to whether he should leave Uhuru alone. So let's hope something happens.
Well, I think the U.S. and Britain in particular...
Yeah, it has never happened before.
Are pushing to get the court to basically set aside...
Because he has international immunity. Now, any other question? Mr. Ferrara, who is coming forth there, who is going back to sit, is... Professor Hillier, the gentleman who was coming and has sat down... No, I'm not troubling you.
I'm waiting until you
he was
finish
our
speaking.
commissioner for the new he was our chairman of the commission for the new constitution. That's Jerry Ferrara, but he's not coming yet.
Go ahead.
Which one?
Mr. Creaky, could you ask your question?
Okay. I was wondering who you were talking to. I thought you were addressing the speaker. Thank you very much. I did enjoy your presentation. I think that there's no doubt in my mind and to most people's mind that colonialism is a violation against human dignity. And I think it is something that is very well recognized and very well documented. Now, we want to look at our experiences here in the BVI over the years. And
One thing, though, we have, I understand, only 15 more minutes.
Okay. I will take, if with your indulgence, I will take 4. Right? Now, the BVI traditionally has always emphasized, at least many of our forebears, the political leaders, the necessity to be economically independent. There was always this quest for economic independence. And the people had wisely seen the nexus between increased costs and obligations of independence, and therefore the need to secure sovereignty with a sound economic base. So that has always been something that has been the foremost of most British Virgin Islands until today. Ironically, citizens have linked the economic successes of the country's constitutional status as a colony, and they have linked the economic successes to the country's constitutional status as a colony, and therefore face the fear of flight of capital and instability in the international financial sector if we were to become independent, despite evidence to the contrary in many countries which are independent today. I can just briefly mention that recently in Bermuda, they have had a Bermuda Independence Commission, and they have stated in their Chamber of Commerce, they have stated that a move to independence in and of itself will not be a reason for them to depart Bermuda, as long as an independent Bermuda maintains the present tax-friendly regulatory regime and a move to independence and did not cause any social or political instability. They felt that as long as things remained the way they were in that respect, there would not be a problem. Of course, there are other people who talk about currency issue. That, too, is not a real issue because most of the currencies are pegged to the US dollar in any event. Okay? But people here fear the economic impact first and foremost of independence. But if we look around, what's really happening, in my view, is that the degree of liberty that we had before and self-governance that we had before is being lessened and eroded, particularly because of the experiences that we've seen in some of the other countries like TCI, Turks and Caicos, and so on, right? So Britain is taking a much stronger hand as a result of the embarrassments and so on that it has suffered. But we, therefore, are caught in a dilemma where we tend to do nothing, and they tend to do everything. So we find ourselves being integrated, whether we know it or not. That is what's happening. So of the options that were cited, independence, free association, and integration, I think one is happening with our eyes wide open. Thank you.
Let me just briefly mention, in comparison between Bermuda and the BVI, if you look at the demographics of Bermuda, it's 50-50, so 50% of the population is people of African descent, and about 20% are non-citizens, and the other 50% are people of Portuguese and other European extraction. And that population, which dominated Bermudian politics for a number of years and then dominates the economy, resisted any form of self-rule for Bermuda. Once the black majority took over the government, there's been a different sentiment towards greater self-rule in Bermuda, not to the extent, and as you outline, that they realize, and they have invited on several occasions the UN Decolonization Commission, which was initially the previous government did not welcome. But in the last couple of cycles, they have welcomed the UN Decolonization Committee to come in and to at least hear from the people, which was resist. Right now, we can't even invite the UN Commission to the Virgin Islands. The United States would not allow for it. And I'm not sure what is the situation with the BVI.
The British would not have prevented them coming. They've been here twice.
Okay. But people are entitled to have that kind of dialogue and to voice their sentiment to the international community in terms of what kind of a relationship they want to have with the colonial. Because as I said, within the United Nations system, this whole issue of colonialism is viewed as illegal.
Certainly. My only reference to Bermuda was to show you that the fear that people have of the flight of capital and instability is not really justified from their own experience or from their own analysis. And that's why I don't think there's much justification for it here. But they do have, based upon the demography and the composition of the population, they do have certain racial issues that are not as salient here, but they do exist there.
Good evening.
Hi, good evening.
Professor, I want to second what one of my good friends said earlier and commend you for your brave words. They are brave words nonetheless. Dr. Archibald, I think you should donate 15 more minutes of your time so we can have a longer discussion since we started late, and you did speak for a long time. But nonetheless, we invited you here to do what you did.
Go ahead.
So thank you so much for that. I had a question for you, but I'm going to just stick to the comment. And I wanted to say, as a young man moving from the BVI to New York, I quickly learned the difference between direct racism and institutional racism. Because if you don't live in a place like New York and you don't live there with your eyes open, you will be blinded by a lot of the institutional behavior there is. So my comment and my question all in one, Professor. Here in the BVI, my good friend talked about you know, the level of autonomy that we as BVI lenders, indigenous BVI lenders, has enjoyed over the years. And it gave us a sense of independence. Although, yes, we're part of the British colony and, you know, that whole institutional behavior, we always felt as if we had some sense of independence. The last white paper that came out, if you really sit back and look at the language and the directions, basically, there's no, you know, my good friend just said, things that happen with the eyes wide open. There's no real relationship if you understand what Great Britain just laid out for us. There's no real partnership. The partnership is, we are coming, we see what you guys are doing, you've done well, but we want to help you do it better. But we've done it good without them. So I commend what you said, you know, Professor. My only question to you now is this. In order for the people of the BVI to even entertain some level of independence or whatever relationship we decide to move forward with, it has to start here. But the people here feel some sense of fear, you know, to even have discussions. They fear instability in the political system, that they might be victimized. They fear if we were independent, we've had, I can cite some case without being controversial, but just recently we had some situation where one of our ministers even made a comment because maybe what he wanted to do, Great Britain said, hey, you have to hold back, remember the protocol that you signed, and he made a comment contrary to that. And people on the street are saying, oh, so if we were independent, the majority of the people are asking questions you don't want to answer, but if we were independent, you would have run with it. So, yes, everything you said is true. We're under Britain, we're a colony. But at the same time, some of us still find some comfort in that. Thinking, not that it's true, but thinking there's some sort of protection. If we had a government similar to some of the other governments in the Caribbean that you yourself cited that are unstable, economically, socially, all upside down. Where do we go and how do we start the discussion as a people feeling secure and trusting the people who are representing themselves as our leaders to move the country forward if we were to start entertaining independence or level of independence?
I'm not sure if, I thought I laid it out in a way that, as I said initially, I'm not looking at independence as an option for any non-self-governing territory. My take is this whole concept of sovereign statehood, which equates independence, is not going to solve many of the global problems we are confronting as a global community. So creating more independent states, whether it's in the Caribbean, in Africa, or in Europe, and as we see, Europe is moving away from this concept of independent states because they realize the futility in this concept which they initially created for themselves. So I understand the fear of the people of the BVI or the US Virgin Islands or Bermuda of what becomes of their economic viability and the high standard of living. But that could quickly evaporate, as we see in Cyprus and other island nations. I mean, this whole concept of, you have very little control over who invests in the BVI or invest in Jamaica or invest in Barbados. They could easily take their money elsewhere. There is a reason why they do it in the BVI, in Bermuda, in the Cayman Islands, in Turks and Caicos, and not in Trinidad, St. Lucia, St. Kitts. Because they fear this international scrutiny that would be brought to bear firsthand. Many of the people who are investing or buying these trusts have never been to the BVI.
Professor Hillier, I would interject and tell you frankly, nobody is going to leave these little islands for those that you mentioned, because those things, when they come to those other countries, become political. It is not political in the BVI. It is not political in the Cayman Islands. It is not political in the countries that are successful, obeying the law. There is not one allegation that the BVI has ever been doing anything illegal, immoral, or unlawful. It's a difference. That's the point.
Well, here's the case of the Cayman Islands, where recently the government of the Cayman Islands signed an agreement with the United States government to make available the list of all Americans who have offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands. The United States government, Switzerland, which had this secrecy, banking secrecy law for over 50 years, the United States government forced Switzerland to modify its laws to make available every American citizen who has Swiss bank accounts in Switzerland in violation of Swiss law. Otherwise, UBS and all the other Swiss banks will be criminally prosecuted. Okay? UBS recently reached an agreement with the Justice Department in which they were forced to pay, I believe, somewhere between $400 and $600 million.
They admitted criminal offenses.
Yes.
They admitted criminal offenses.
They did not admit criminal offense, but what they did was criminal, okay? Because to come to the United States and advise wealthy Americans on ways to conceal their assets to avoid paying taxes was a criminal offense. And
Ferrara?
UBS in return agreed to make available the list of all wealthy Americans with bank accounts in their banks and allow the Justice Department and the IRS to pursue them. The world is a very small place.
It's all right.
And it's a very transparent place. As I said in my presentation, the international investigative journalists were able to come up with names of very high-profile government officials in countries that you may never have heard about, who have trust and companies in the BVI.
But they are lawful. They are lawful.
Well,
they are lawful.
No, it's not. I'm not denying. I'm not denying they are lawful.
No, but no.
But it's using the company that is registered here
lawful
to then carry out criminal activities
internationally
or unlawful
lawful
activities. That is the problem. When these companies that are perfectly legal in the BVI carry out activities in the UK, in the US, and in Switzerland in violation of their laws. That is where the ethical issue comes up. Go ahead, sir.
Yes, thank you very much for the time. Professor Hillier, thank you. I want to say something constructive and positive. Let me say, first of all, thank you for coming and taking on this particular subject of self-governance, because it's a very important topic, and it is one that we here in the British Virgin Islands need, at least from time to time, to engage ourselves in terms of open discussion in a public forum such as this. And it may be, as often is the case, it takes, as it were, someone from outside to be brought in to start that discussion and to stimulate our thought processes in relation thereto. Now, you know, one of the things that I think I should say right off the bat is that Dr. Archibald mentioned early on about our Constitution and my having some part to play in this. The preamble to our Constitution speaks of self-governance. And I'll read a very short passage. I'm not going to spend my time reading. Affirming that the people of the Virgin Islands have generally expressed their desire to become a self-governing people and to exercise the highest degree of control over the affairs of their country at this stage of its development. And noting that the United Kingdom, the administering power for the time being, has articulated a desire to enter into a modern partnership, and I'll come back to that, with the Virgin Islands based on the principles of mutual respect and self-determination. Now, that is in the preamble to our Constitution, which the British government approved in 2006 and came into effect in 2007. But one of the things that we must understand is that when that Constitution was negotiated and brought into effect, we were then under the umbrella of the previous white paper, which Dr. Archibald made reference to. We now have a new white paper, and I don't know if you've had an opportunity to look at this document and to read it, but there has been really a paradigm shift in emphasis. Whereas in the previous white paper, there was a lot of talk about a modern partnership, etc., etc. Now, the real essence of the new white paper is embrace your British characteristics. Embrace your British characteristics. And this has not been not only written in that white paper, it has been articulated to us on visits here by representatives of the United Kingdom government. So much so that one of our prominent local citizens at a particular occasion say, "What Britishness are you speaking about?" You know, because essentially, I mean, if we were to classify ourselves here, we have more Americanship than Britishship, right? And so on and so forth. So the emphasis has really changed, and the new white paper also speaks to the whole question of, it's under the banner really of giving assistance, where you kind of pair your departments of government here with the corresponding department of government in the United Kingdom government, and they will assist you and provide expertise whether on a continuing basis. Now, some of this can be positive, but you know, it is really a completely different approach in terms of how they view us and how we are to operate as a country in relation to the United Kingdom and the status which we hold with them. And the one thing I wish really to speak to today and really to support you actually in what you have said, and it is this. We have learned from negotiating with the United Kingdom government that the options that they permit during constitutional talks are extremely limited. Extremely limited. Even the whole concept of associated statehood, which some of our now independent territories enjoyed some years ago, that is completely off the table. Completely off the table. So you're really, in essence, in terms of self-governance, in terms of self-determination, in terms of a particular, carving out a particular kind of relationship, you are confined to certain very narrow and limited parameters. And it is within those parameters that you're expected to and required to negotiate and eke out either constitutional amendment or a new constitution. And I embrace your suggestion, generally speaking, that we ought to look at various types of relationships, constitutional and otherwise, if we are really to move forward and realize a higher level of self-determination. And this is very, very important. And it may very well not be the three that the United Nations have set out, because I think that really we should not be limited to those. And you know, it comes back to something about colonialism, let me say this, which is morally reprehensible. I agree with you. It is colonialism in any form. It is morally reprehensible. And we have it here in the BVI. Let us not move away from that. We can say that we've enjoyed a certain level of autonomy. We've been able to, you know, generate our own monies and support ourselves and so on and so forth. It's like the one child who has struck it well. The parents don't have to worry about them, except that they still have the parental control to be exercised as and when they see fit, right? As and when they see fit. But here in the BVI, one of the remnants of that colonial experience, in my view, is that in terms of our own thinking, we slavishly follow the patterns and the constructs that have been given to us and embrace them without thinking, as the phrase that is used, I think, too often now, thinking outside the box. We even do it in the legal profession. It's one of the professions where we do it the most. We embrace the judicial decisions of the English courts when really they don't fit very well in the context of the BVI and the Caribbean culture and experience. And ultimately, our own judges embrace it even more sometimes than the English judges, who have the audacity to tell us in the Privy Council that this is something that is not really fitting within your cultural construct and you shouldn't do it. And that is something which we have as a legacy from the colonial experience. And these are the kind of things that we need to change. We need to find, it is not, I agree with you, we cannot as a small country expect to be independent, whatever that means in today's world, right? Because there's nothing good about being independent and broke.
Exactly.
Right, exactly. We don't want that. Yeah. But at the same time, we must be able to think and articulate a different kind of relationship that moves us forward, gives us more autonomy and more self-governance, and at the same time does not expose us to the pitfalls that have befallen some of our Caribbean countries who have gone independent, perhaps prematurely. I'll stop there for the time.
Mr. Ferrara.
Thank you very much.
Mr. Ferrara, before you move from the podium, before Professor Hillier responds, let me ask you if you could develop 2 points here. In international law, there are some things in the Constitution which have never been discussed in this country by anybody, publicly. One, as an international lawyer, I know, and you know, and Dr. Hillier knows, we depend on air navigation services. No country in the Caribbean controls its air navigation services. In fact, you have to have a major country involved with you to get by in air navigation services. One. Secondly, we're a maritime country. we might have some control over our coastal sea, or what people like to call the continental shelf. But when it comes to the economic area of the sea, like between here and Anegada and outside of Anegada, 150, 200 miles, we do not have the ways and means to control that or to influence that at all. That's international again. Now, how do you see whether we remain a colony or we become a non-colony? How do you see the BVI for the future dealing with those international assets, the air and the sea, which are vital to our continued survival and success?
Well,
what relationship we will have with whom?
That is a very important question. And it's probably one that does not bring a quick and immediate answer. Because, you know, we quite frankly, I mean, we have certain limitations purely by virtue of our size and our resources. And as you rightly pointed out, we don't have the wherewithal to police and enforce those, you know, our rights in our economic zone and so on and so forth. So we have certain limitations as a small country. And what does that really mean for us? We live in a world that is becoming smaller and smaller, where even the bigger countries are finding themselves so interdependent upon another country or countries, to the extent where even with their resources, they themselves cannot unilaterally control some of the very things that you have mentioned. And so, you know, it comes down to having the freedom. And this comes back, I think, to the issue of self-determination and where we go from here. It comes back to having the freedom and ability to negotiate what we consider to be in our best interest and with whom. And it comes to a point which Professor Hillier mentioned earlier, which is very correct, that we don't have the ability in the international forums to represent ourselves and represent our own interests. We invariably have to go through the United Kingdom. And to the extent that we are permitted to do so, it is just that. We are permitted to do so in a limited context and a limited situation. And that is one of the things that came up during the constitutional talks. And the extent to which we were able to make any ground on that was that should be put in a side letter, not in the Constitution. And this is one of the things that a lot of people don't know in the BVI, that this document here, the Constitution, there are a couple of side letters signed between our government and which permitted us to do more than the Constitution itself, you know, authorized us to do, but it is on the basis that it can be taken back from us at any point in time. Coming back to what Professor Hillier has been saying about how we are treated. But what I think is the overall issue here is what kind of relationship can we progress to whereby we have the ability and the latitude to carve out those kind of agreements that would be in our best interest, as we see it as being in our best interest. And that is where we need to get to. Yes, we have the economic pillars and so on, although they are under siege at the moment, so to speak. We know. But siege from countries that, you know, should be protecting us. Exactly. But you know, it's one thing to have that economic freedom and having a high per capita income and a good livelihood and so on and so forth. But part of sustaining that is also having the ability through a new relationship to be able to negotiate on things that are critical and important to the sustaining of those things that are important to your economic viability and success and for future generations to come. And the issues that you have raised, I think, fall within that context if we have the freedom and latitude to negotiate those things. But I think I'm getting to the point where I'm maybe dominating.
I just want to say two things.
Professor Hillier has the last word.
Yeah. Well,
I
will.
Come to the mic?
Yeah.
You can come to the mic.
Because he raised some very good points, but with regards to you were claiming the BVI would not be able to manage its marine resources or airspace. I mean, the Third United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, 1982, addressed precisely those kinds of concerns. And I mentioned the UN, the General Assembly Resolution on Permanent Sovereignty over Natural Resources, which would tie into this new sea regime, where you have 12 miles instead of 3 miles territorial sea, a 200 exclusive economic zone, 200-mile exclusive economic zone, and beyond that is the high sea, which is for all of mankind.
Yeah, but you have to face the fact, Professor Hillier, that the United Nations have failed in that because they are always putting predominantly the political and underrate the economic.
Well, again, let me just say, if you look before, where the sea was nobody's territory and the whole 3-mile limit to the ocean was determined by major sea powers like the Dutch, like the British, simply arbitrarily say, you have 3 miles. And even those without sea had control over the resources in the Caribbean and elsewhere. It's still a problem today. Who is fishing in the Caribbean Sea? The Chinese and the Koreans. Who is patrolling the Caribbean Ocean? The US Navy, not the British Navy.
Oh, yes.
Right? And the airspace issue, I mean, rightfully so, most countries in the Caribbean do not have the means, but so do most countries everywhere, because the FAA, which is the Federal Aviation Administration, basically implement and enforce the rules that is passed by the International Civil Aviation Administration, which is a United Nations agency. So much of international law is not enforced or implemented by international institutions, but it's done by agencies within major powers like the United States.
All right, we're coming up to the last question now. We have to face the fact, Professor Hillier, that the law of the sea is the oldest international law. It's over 1,000 years old and hasn't changed much.
Well, it certainly has, based on the 1982 agreement. Yeah. But again, it's Ferrara made a couple of points. My friend was the chair of the Decolonization Committee and had meetings with the British government over this very same issue you're talking about, where the British never opted for associated statehood for the existing territories, whereas the now independent Caribbean nations had that associated statehood for a period of time in which they prepared them for independence. The British attitude is you either remain a colony or you opt for independence. And that really doesn't give you a great deal of parameters in which you negotiate from. And that is really the sticking point with your new constitution, that Britain gives some limited rights and then withhold the rest. But more importantly, I want to ask, what would happen if tomorrow, given the government in England and the economic decay that is taking place in the UK at this time, were to simply turn around and relinquish control of the BVI? Would you have a choice? If Britain were to turn around and basically say to you, you are on your own because we can't handle overseas territory, what's your options? Go ahead, ma'am.
If your nose hole was a pose hole.
Thank you.
I don't believe in all these ifs. I believe in reality. because the world is an old place and it could be a new place. I don't believe in all of this. But could we have the last question? Could you come forward, please?
I wish to congratulate you, sir, on giving a very clear, defining, philosophic view of what has really made the world into what it's like today, the third world. Our problem, I think, our defeat has come because of the lack within ourselves of developing the science and the technology. That really is what has brought the absolute control of what has in effect become the third world. And I think one of the challenges that we have to realize for ourselves is how do we redefine what is the quality of life and what is the standard of living that we would wish for ourselves. And I think until we in the third world really seriously think of how we should use the resources of the planet in a disciplined way through science and hence the technology that we would get from that scientific thought process and redefine for ourselves, not from what Western civilization has given as what should be the quality of life and the standard of living. We'll never be at peace with ourselves. And it goes back to your philosophic belief that this question of sovereignty and colonialism, to me, that's the resolution to that wide division in which the world is at present. And perhaps what's creating a lot of the horror on the earth, the terrorism, just the unhappiness that one senses every time you hear a news report. Thank you.
Well, I think that's a very good way to close it, in that you couldn't have said it better than our values as a people, what we consider to be important for the survival of the planet. I mean, if happiness is consumerism, material goods, I mean, the planet and its resources are not infinite. And if we continue on the trend of basically associating happiness and the good life with the ability to consume, I mean, we are bringing down our own destruction as a people or the world by simply assuming to be developed, to be independent, is to have that economic power to purchase more and more goods. It's not the solution. And it doesn't bring happiness. I mean, the world is now very wired. You could go to the most remote parts of the world where someone is going to trade food, sex, whatever, in order to have a mobile phone. Some of the most remote parts of the world where people are dirt poor, and they would trade these various activities, yeah, and even kill another human being just for these gadgets. So you think about it, where are we heading as a human race? And is there an end to all of this? So, thank you very much. And I...
Master Ceremonies, Professor Hillier, ladies and gentlemen, we're coming to the end of a very interesting night. I personally would like to thank Professor Hillier for what I would regard as a very professional, experiential, intellectual, provocative, and challenging address. I'm glad you came, Professor Hillier.